Who do you think you are?
Sir, I can do this!
Prove it! Move!
The last man who grabbed her arm spent 3 weeks in physical therapy. Sergeant Cole Harmon didn't know that yet. He was standing in the middle of Fort Caldwell's main courtyard at 6:14 in the morning, the Nevada sun already climbing hard and mean above the ridgeline, burning the moisture out of the air before most men had finished their first cup of coffee. He was barking at a private who had made the mistake of appearing in his line of sight. That was all it took with Harmon. Appearing. The private was 19 years old, maybe 20. He had the kind of face that still belonged in a high school hallway, and he was standing at rigid attention while Harmon circled him slowly the way a wolf circles something it has already decided to kill and is only drawing out the pleasure of the moment. The private's bootlaces were tied the wrong way, not the wrong way by any military regulation. The wrong way by Harmon's personal standard, which changed depending on his mood and which no written rule supported. Harmon knew this. The private knew this. Every soldier within earshot knew this. Not one of them said a word. That was the thing about Fort Caldwell in the summer of 2024. Nobody said a word. Harmon was 6'2", 230 pounds, with the kind of neck that looked like it had been carved out of old wood. He had done 3 tours as a ranger before landing here, and somewhere in those years the war had gotten into him in ways that didn't heal clean. He wore his rank the way some men wear a weapon. Not for protection, for use. His full name was Sergeant Cole Harmon, and on paper he was a non-commissioned officer with a distinguished combat record and a disciplinary file that should have ended his career twice over. On paper, he had been warned, counseled, documented. On paper, systems existed to handle men like him, but Colonel Warren Hayes signed the papers. And Colonel Hayes had his reasons for keeping Cole Harmon exactly where he was. Those reasons were 4 years old, and they had never been spoken aloud, and 2 men who could have spoken them were buried in cemeteries far from Nevada. Harmon finished his slow circle around the private. He stopped directly in front of the boy and leaned in close enough that the private could smell the black coffee on his breath. "You know what I see when I look at you," Harmon said. The private stared straight ahead, said nothing, had learned by now that nothing was the only safe answer. "I see a waste of a uniform," Harmon said. "I see something that wandered in off the street and put on clothes that belonged to real soldiers." He stepped back, looked the private up and down one more time. Then he turned away, already losing interest, already scanning the courtyard for the next thing, the next person, the next small power he could exercise just to feel the shape of it in his hands. That was when he saw her. She came through the main gate on foot, which was unusual. Most new arrivals came by vehicle. She was carrying a single black duffel bag over one shoulder, not struggling with it, not shifting it from side to side, the way people do when something is heavier than expected. She carried it the way you carry something you have carried 1,000 times in the dark over worse terrain than this. She was not tall, not imposing by any obvious measure. She had dark hair pulled back from a face that was 47 years old, in the way that certain kinds of weather are 47 years old. Not aged, just settled, like something that has been tested so many times it no longer needs to announce what it is. She wore standard issue fatigues that told you nothing. Rank on the collar, but nobody was close enough yet to read it. She walked without urgency and without hesitation, which is a harder combination to achieve than most people realize. Urgency without hesitation is common. Calm without hesitation is rare. Her eyes were the color of shallow ice over deep water. She crossed the courtyard without looking at anyone specifically and without avoiding anyone's gaze. She moved through the space the way experienced soldiers move through unfamiliar territory, taking it all in, cataloging, deciding. Corporal Cade Pruitt, Harmon's most loyal shadow, was the first to notice her. He leaned toward Harmon slightly and said something low. Harmon turned. He watched her for a moment. Then he smiled. The paperwork that had preceded her arrival described Commander Marlowe Reeves as a logistics support specialist on temporary assignment. The paperwork was technically accurate in the same way that describing the ocean as a large body of water is technically accurate. It captured the surface and missed everything underneath. Her file, the real one, lived behind 3 separate encryption barriers inside a Department of Defense server that most senior officers at Fort Caldwell would never have clearance to access. The real file was 142 pages long. Large sections remained classified. The unclassified portions contained phrases like operational success in denied territory and recovered asset under fire and decision under pressure, complete mission integrity maintained. There were commendations written by people whose own names were classified. There were performance reviews that used words like exceptional and unparalleled, and once in a note written by a two-star admiral who chose his words with surgical care irreplaceable. At the bottom of the first page below her name and her years of service, a single line had been added in 2009 by an officer in Naval Special Warfare Command. Callsign Ghost. Not because she was hard to find, because by the time anyone realized she had been somewhere, she was already gone. She had spent 25 years doing things that don't get discussed at base mess halls, places that don't appear on news reports, situations where the mission brief was classified before it began and the after-action report was classified before it was written. She had operated in countries whose governments publicly denied any American military presence, and she had come home from all of them. Not always whole, but always home. She was 47 years old, and she was tired in a way that sleep did not fix. She had put in the transfer request herself. Quiet duty, simple assignment, a place to breathe without calculating threat vectors. Fort Caldwell was supposed to be that place. She was hoping to make it through the morning without a confrontation. Harmon crossed the courtyard toward her with the particular stride of a man who believes he owns the ground beneath his feet. Pruitt followed 2 steps behind, the way he always did. Around them, soldiers who had seen this walk before quietly found reasons to look elsewhere. Marlowe saw him coming when he was 30 yards out. She read him in the time it took most people to blink. 6'2", heavy through the chest and shoulders, walking with his weight forward, which meant he was accustomed to intimidating people with his physical presence and had never had genuine cause to question whether it would work. Combat veteran, yes. The way he carried his arms confirmed that. But the confidence he wore right now was not the confidence of someone who had faced real danger recently. It was the confidence of a man who had gone unchallenged for a very long time. She filed this and kept walking. He stepped into her path at 10 feet. Hey. She stopped, met his eyes, offered the kind of nod soldiers exchange out of basic courtesy, the kind that means nothing and requires nothing in return. Morning, Sergeant. She started walking again. He stepped sideways, blocking her path. The expression on his face was not quite a smile. It was something else wearing a smile's shape. You lost, he said. This base isn't a daycare for soft recruits. Pruitt made a sound behind him, attempting a laugh, not quite achieving one. Marlowe stopped again. She regarded Harmon with the patient attention of someone who has faced men far more dangerous than this in places far darker than a Nevada parade ground at 6 in the morning. Men who were genuinely lethal and genuinely intended harm, and who had without exception discovered that intention alone was insufficient. I know enough, she said. I'm reporting to my CO. Your CO, he let the words sit in his mouth. Right now I am your CO. That's how this works here. He took a step closer, then another. He was skilled at this. The incremental compression of space. The slow reduction of distance until the other person either stepped back, surrendering ground, and the psychological weight that went with it or held their position, which provided him an excuse to escalate. Marlowe held her position. Rule 1, he said, dropping his voice to something meant to feel like gravity. When I'm talking to you, you don't move. You don't blink. You don't breathe unless I permit it. She held his gaze for a long moment. Sergeant, she said quietly, end this conversation now. Something moved across his face, not doubt, not yet. The slight recalibration of a man who has heard words like that before and never been required to take them seriously. Or what? He leaned in, close enough that she could feel his breath. You going to cry? His hand came up and closed around her forearm. He was still smiling when the world moved. What happened next occupied less than 2 seconds. Those 2 seconds contained more controlled violence than most soldiers witness in a career. Marlowe's expression didn't change. Not one muscle shifted, but something else changed, something underneath the stillness. Something old and trained and absolute that lived in the quiet place behind her eyes and had been waiting with the infinite patience of things that know their moment will come. Her body moved the way water moves through a narrow channel. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Her weight transferred to her lead foot. Her shoulder rotated with precise economy, and Harmon's grip on her arm became the instrument of his own undoing. She used his force, his mass, his committed momentum. Everything he had put into this moment and redirected it with the efficiency of someone who had practiced this response 10,000 times in training and applied it in the field more often than she cared to count. Her hip rotated, her arm came through clean. 230 pounds of former Army Ranger left the ground. He went up, then he came down. The impact with the parade ground was not theatrical. It was real. The sound of a large man hitting hard earth with gravity's full endorsement behind him, air expelled from his lungs in a single brutal compression, every system in his body registering the catastrophic reversal of what had been happening a fraction of a second before. He lay on his back, staring at the Nevada sky. Around the courtyard, 30-some soldiers stood completely still. Pruitt's mouth was open. Marlowe stepped back. Her breathing was unchanged. Her stance had settled into something that was neither aggressive nor relaxed, and was, for anyone who understood what they were observing, unmistakably the posture of a person who had done this before and remained prepared to continue if the situation required it. Harmon made a sound, something between a groan and a word that hadn't finished forming. His eyes blinked rapidly, trying to re-establish contact with reality. She set her duffel on the ground beside her, reached into the outer pocket, removed a matte black case with a magnetic clasp small enough to fit in a jacket pocket, but heavy in the hand in a way that communicated the weight of its contents before the contents were seen. She walked over to where Harmon was lying, placed the case on his chest. He opened it with hands that had not yet fully recovered their steadiness. Inside, set against dark backing material, was a credential that most soldiers at Fort Caldwell had never encountered in person. Gold insignia, Black Division designation. A service record rendered in the compressed language of a career that required compression to fit. And at the bottom, pressed into the material in letters smaller than everything else, and somehow heavier, Commander Marlowe Reeves, Naval Special Warfare, SEAL Team Valor, Black Operations Division. 25 years active service. Callsign Ghost. The silence around the courtyard had a texture to it now. Harmon stared at the credential. His face had changed entirely. The smile was gone. What remained was something pale and reconfiguring, desperately trying to find new ground to stand on in a landscape that had just shifted beyond recognition. "You assaulted a superior officer," Marlowe said. Her voice carried the same register as it had when she said good morning. Level, without performance. "That's your first mistake." She picked up her duffel. "Your second was putting your hands on someone whose history you don't know." She looked at him for one more moment, not with contempt, not with satisfaction, with the expression of a person who has encountered a problem they had hoped not to find and have now resolved and can file away. She retrieved the badge case, closed it, and walked toward the administration building. Nobody moved until she was through the door. Then very slowly the courtyard began to breathe again. Colonel Warren Hayes had an office that smelled of old coffee and the particular staleness of a man who had occupied the same room making the same decisions for too long. He was 58 years old with the careful posture of someone who had learned to manage his appearance as a tool of authority. He had served with genuine distinction for a long time. He was not a bad man in the simple way that some men are bad. He was something more complicated and in certain ways harder to forgive. He was a man who had made one terrible choice 4 years ago and had spent every day since building walls around it. The walls required maintenance. The maintenance required compromises. The compromises required more maintenance. Somewhere in that compounding process, Warren Hayes had stopped being the officer he once was and become instead the careful custodian of his own secret. He was standing when Marlowe entered his office. This registered. Officers did not always stand for incoming temporary personnel. "Commander Reeves," he said, "welcome to Fort Caldwell." "Thank you, sir." He nodded. His hands were clasped behind his back. It was a posture that appeared formal and composed from the front, but from the side, the knuckles were pressed together slightly harder than necessary. "I heard about the incident this morning," he said. His tone was measured, diplomatic in the careful way of someone navigating pre-mapped terrain. "With Sergeant Harmon." "Yes, sir." "I want you to know that his behavior," he paused, started again with different words. "Fort Caldwell maintains high standards. What happened this morning, doesn't represent, sir." She kept her voice level. He stopped. "I don't require an apology for Sergeant Harmon," she said. "What happened was handled." Hayes nodded. Something moved in his expression. Not relief, something adjacent to relief, but cooler and calculating, the look of a man whose mental arithmetic has just produced a number he isn't sure he trusts. He came around the desk, extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and practiced the handshake of someone who had spent decades projecting steadiness through the simple act of physical contact. Then his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at it, just once. The involuntary reflex of a man checking something he had been expecting. His eyes moved to the screen and came back to her face in under a second. But in that under a second, she saw what the preview line displayed, a single name. Above a message string she couldn't read at this distance. The name was Harmon. Hayes pocketed the phone without comment, walked her to the door with the smooth ease of a man who had just made a decision and was committed to not letting that decision show on his face. "I hope you find what you're looking for here, Commander," he said. "That's exactly what I'm here for," she said. They looked at each other across the brief geography of a doorway. Both of them said things that were technically true and fundamentally incomplete. Both of them, for different reasons, had decided that this moment was not the time to say more. She walked back out into the Nevada heat. Behind her, the door closed softly. She did not look back. But she filed what she had seen with the same precision. She filed everything because Hayes had not looked at that message the way a commanding officer reviews a routine update. He had looked at it the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for and is not relieved to receive. That was not the expression of a CO managing a personnel situation. That was the expression of a man managing something else entirely. Inside his office, Hayes stood very still. Then he went to his desk, opened a drawer, looked at something inside it without touching it. Then he closed the drawer and sat down and stared at nothing in particular with the focused inward attention of a man doing complex mathematics in a space where the numbers don't improve no matter how many times you run them. By noon, the story of the courtyard had traveled to every corner of Fort Caldwell. It moved the way stories move in closed systems, gaining embellishments as it went, losing certain facts, accumulating others. By the time it reached the motor pool, Harmon had been described as fighting back before being thrown. By the time it reached the drone operators, the badge case had become a classified dossier. By the time it reached the mess hall, someone had added that Harmon wept, which was not true, but which people wanted to be true, and in the absence of evidence, they chose to believe it anyway. What everyone agreed on, regardless of which version they had received, was the essential core of the thing. A woman no one had heard of had arrived at Fort Caldwell that morning. One bag, no announcement. And Harmon, who had been untouchable for 2 years, was in the medical wing nursing a dislocated shoulder and a humiliation so complete it had changed the atmospheric pressure of every room where his name was spoken. Harmon was not talking, not in the way people expected. He had tried initially to claim the incident was unprovoked. But 30 witnesses occupied that courtyard, and none of them were willing to support a version of events that contradicted what their own eyes had delivered. Harmon had grabbed her. Harmon had made the threat. Harmon had introduced his hands into a situation that then resolved itself according to physics and 25 years of applied expertise. The witnesses said these things carefully, in the measured way of people who understand that the structure of a place is shifting and have not yet determined which direction it will settle. But they said them. In the medical wing, the doctor who reset Harmon's shoulder was professionally sympathetic and personally careful to say nothing substantive. Harmon lay on the medical bay cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about things he had not been required to think about in 2 years. He thought about the way she had moved. The complete absence of hesitation. The lack of any readable emotion in it. He had been in the presence of dangerous people before, had been one of them in places where it was sanctioned and necessary. What he had encountered in that courtyard was something different. For the first time in 2 years, he had felt the clarifying sensation of encountering something that would not reorganize itself to accommodate him. He turned this over and over on the medical cot, and what it became slowly was not humility. What it became was resolve. The barracks assigned to Marlowe were in the northeast corner of the main residential block, away from the high-traffic corridors, a room that communicated in the language of military logistics that she was not a priority. The window faced a concrete wall. The overhead light had a flicker in it that a pending work order had failed to address for 6 weeks. She sat at the small desk and opened her laptop. She navigated to the Fort Caldwell logistics network, which her assignment gave her legitimate access to. She was not looking for anything specific. She was reading the surface of the place. The maintenance records, the scheduling logs, the ordinary administrative texture of a base conducting its routine business. The kind of reading you do when you are new somewhere and want to understand the shape of the institution before you engage with its substance. Nothing alarming surfaced. Nothing was meant to not on the first night. She closed the laptop after 20 minutes. She was tired, and she had learned long ago that the first night in a new place was for orientation, not excavation. She reached instead for the inner pocket of her duffel, the one with the zipper that no longer closed completely, the one she had stopped trying to repair, because the slight resistance of it had become familiar, in the way that small imperfections become familiar when they have accompanied you long enough. She removed a photograph, printed on standard photo paper edges softened by years of handling. It had been taken in 2019 in a location she would not name in any conversation that was not absolutely necessary on a day that had been unremarkable, in the way that days can be unremarkable when operating in places where unremarkable simply means everyone came home. In the photograph, she was standing next to a man who was laughing at something outside the frame. He had been 34 when the photograph was taken. He had been 36 when she gave the order to fall back. She placed the photograph on the shelf above the bed, not inside the duffel anymore, not in the inner pocket, on the shelf, where she could see it in the morning without having to reach for it. She lay back without changing out of her fatigues the way she had lain on 1,000 beds, in 1,000 places fully dressed boots, still on the habit of readiness, so structural it had long since ceased to be a choice. The flickering light did what it did. Tomorrow, she thought she would begin to understand what Fort Caldwell actually was beneath the surface of what it presented. Hayes's face when he checked his phone, Harmon's 2 years of unchallenged authority, the specific quality of the silence that surrounded both of them. She closed her eyes. She did not dream about anything at all. Word travels fast inside a closed system. By the morning after Marlowe's arrival, Fort Caldwell had divided itself into two groups, those who had been in the courtyard and those who had only heard about it. The first group was quiet in a particular way, the quietness of people whose understanding of what is possible has been revised without warning. The second group was louder, filling the space between what they knew and what they imagined. Harmon had not appeared at morning assembly. His absence was noted by everyone and mentioned by no one. Marlowe moved through her first full day at Fort Caldwell the way she moved through every unfamiliar environment. Observation before engagement. She learned the rhythms of the place. The shift change times, the bottlenecks in the corridors, which buildings attracted foot traffic and at what hours. She cataloged faces without assigning them significance, knowing that significance would reveal itself in time, and that patience was more reliable than assumption. She ate at a table near the east wall of the mess hall facing the room and noticed that two of the cooks went quiet when a particular storage corridor was mentioned, and that a motor pool mechanic ate alone at the far end of the last table and kept his eyes on his tray for the entire meal. She filed these things, did not yet know what they meant, trusted that she would. The gymnasium was in the basement of the main support building. She arrived at 1900 hours when the space was mostly empty. She had been working the heavy bag for 20 minutes when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Single person, medium build, no hesitation in the descent. Someone who knew exactly where they were going. She kept working. Captain Garrett Cross came through the door and went to the weights on the far side of the room without looking at her. He worked in silence. She kept working. This arrangement continued for several minutes. Two people who had both apparently decided that the space was large enough for what each of them needed to do in it. Then he said without preamble, "You should know that Harmon doesn't process humiliation quietly." She stopped the bag and turned. He was not looking at her. He was adjusting a bar with the focused attention of someone whose hands need occupation, while their mouth says things they have thought carefully about. "Most people who challenge him here find reasons to transfer out within a month," he said, "or they stop being problems for him in other ways." "How long has he been running this base?" she said. Cross set the bar down. He looked at her directly for the first time. He had the careful eyes of someone accustomed to observing things from significant distances through precise optics, and those eyes were currently doing what they were trained to do. "Officially, he doesn't run anything. He's a staff sergeant with a conduct file." He paused. "Unofficially, 2 years at full strength. Before that, he was building toward it." And Hayes, it wasn't a question. She was watching his face to determine whether he knew the answer, suspected it, or had not yet reached it. What she saw was that he had reached it, had been living alongside it in fact for some time, and had found no way through it from where he stood. "That," Cross said carefully, "is something I've been trying to understand for 8 months." She turned back to the bag, hit it twice. Left, right. The strikes had the clean economy of things that no longer require conscious execution. "I'm not here to fix Fort Caldwell," she said. "I know." He picked up the bar again. "I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm asking you to know what you're standing in the middle of." "I already know." And she did. Not the full shape of it yet, but enough. A thing can often be read from its edges before its center is visible, and the edges of Fort Caldwell had been offering information from the moment she walked through the gate. Hayes's phone. The silence in the courtyard. The mechanic eating alone. When Cross was leaving, he paused at the bottom of the stairs. "You know what stays with me about Harmon?" She waited. His Ranger record. Kandahar 2009. He carried 2 wounded men across 400 meters of exposed ground under fire. Nobody ordered him to. Cross held the stair rail and looked at the middle distance for a moment. That was 15 years ago. Then he went up, and the gym was hers again. She stood with both hands against the heavy bag and thought about what that meant. Not the Kandahar story specifically. She knew men like that, men who had been genuinely good at something that mattered, and had traveled a long distance from it through years of accumulated grievance and institutional failure, and the particular corrosion that sets in when what is best in a person goes unrewarded long enough that the person stops offering it. She understood that distance. She did not excuse it, but she understood it. She was thinking about Hayes and the phone. On the second night, she went back to the laptop, this time not reading the surface, reading the architecture. The way a filing system is organized tells you as much about what it is hiding as what it contains, because people who build structures to conceal things must still build a structure around the absence, and absences have shapes. She was looking for gaps. She found one at 11:47 on the second night. The incident reporting logs for the period between March and July of 2020 had a specific quality. Not empty, if anything overfull. Too many minor reports clustered in too short a window, carrying the smell of documentation generated in volume to provide cover for something that required covering. She had seen this technique before. It was not sophisticated. It was the administrative equivalent of making noise to drown out a specific sound. She moved through the maintenance subfolders, looking not for what was there, but for what was shaped like something removed. At 12:03 on the second night, she found the preliminary report. She read it once, then again more slowly. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the concrete wall outside her window. Private First Class Aaron Delk, 22 years old, from Macon, Georgia. Specialist Timothy Rourke, 24 years old, from Portland, Oregon. The official report classified their deaths as a training accident resulting from navigational error. Harmon appeared as a witness. Hayes appeared as the reviewing authority. The language was technically precise and systematically vague in the way that language is sometimes constructed to be both of those things simultaneously, each sentence accurate in itself and misleading in aggregate. The preliminary report, the one that existed before anyone had decided what shape the story would take, was different. It described an order given without adequate reconnaissance, an officer whose judgment had been impaired. A decision made in conditions that should have produced a different decision would have produced a different decision from a man exercising his full faculties. The name attached to the order was Harmon. The name of the officer who had been present, who had written the preliminary report himself, and then participated in replacing it with the official version, was Colonel Warren Hayes. Hayes had not given the order that killed those men. He had given the order that buried the truth about who did. She printed one page, the page with both names and the date in the language that no administrative architecture had managed to fully neutralize even after 4 years. She folded it once and placed it in her breast pocket. She did not sleep well that night, but she slept. She had learned over 25 years that sleep was operational, not optional, and that her feelings about the conditions that preceded it were largely irrelevant to its necessity. The incident at the motor pool happened on the third afternoon. The heat was at its Nevada worst. The air above the concrete carrying that liquid shimmer that turns the middle distance into something unreliable. Marlowe was crossing from the administrative block to the support building when she heard Harmon's voice, not the controlled authority of his courtyard performance, something less organized. The voice of a man generating noise because noise was the instrument he had decided to reach for. She changed direction. The motor pool was a wide concrete space bordered on 3 sides by metal-roofed storage structures and on the 4th by chain-link fence with the desert beyond it. When she arrived, she found 20 soldiers arranged in the unconscious geometry of people who want to be elsewhere but have been caught too close to something they cannot ignore. Harmon was at the center. He was screaming at a mechanic, a young woman in stained work clothes who was standing very still, with her eyes on the ground in the practiced stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is the least dangerous response. The substance of his screaming was vehicle tampering, sabotage, threats to base safety, the specific rhetoric of a man generating a loud explanation for something that had a quieter and different actual cause. Marlowe watched. She read the room the way she had been reading rooms for a long time. The mechanic's stillness, the quality of fear in the soldiers who were looking at their boots or the scour of their own hands, the studied neutrality of people who have learned that engagement costs more than absence. And she read Cade Pruitt. He stood to Harmon's left and slightly behind him, the position he always occupied, but something in the quality of his standing had changed. He was maintaining it through active effort rather than comfortable habit, which was different from every previous time she had observed him. His jaw was set. His arms were at his sides. He had the posture of a man holding a position that has become, without his having consciously decided it, newly uncomfortable. The mechanic was crying, silently, without moving, tears tracking down a face that was working hard to remain composed. Pruitt's eyes moved to the tiers, then to Harmon, then to his own boots, and then without announcement, without declaration, he took one step to the side. Just one. A lateral adjustment of perhaps 18 inches. He moved out of the position he always occupied and stood in a new place and said nothing and did nothing except exist somewhere different than where he had always chosen to stand. Nobody else noticed. Marlowe filed it. Then she walked forward. Sergeant Harmon, her voice carried without volume. It had a quality that cut through ambient noise the way a clean signal cuts through interference. Harmon spun. The look on his face when he saw her was not simple. Anger, which she had anticipated. And underneath it, something that had been building for 3 days, the accumulation of specific damage that humiliation does to men who have never learned to process it as anything other than fuel. Well, the smile reappeared, different this time. The frame of a smile was something else filling the interior. Look who decided to join us. Stand down, Sergeant. Stand down, he tasted the words. You put your hands on me in front of my people, and now you're giving orders. He took a step toward her. You think that's how this works? That mechanic is dismissed, Marlowe said. He held for a moment. In front of this many witnesses with the incident report from 2 days ago, still unsettled, blocking a direct order openly was terrain he recognized as dangerous. His calculation held. The mechanic picked up her toolbox and walked quickly and without looking back to the far end of the motor pool. Harmon watched her go. Then he looked back. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, deliberately. A lower voice is its own kind of threat in an open space, communicating to the people around you that you are capable of restraint, which implies you are choosing not to exercise it. You ruined everything, he said. 2 years. I built something functional here, something that worked the way it was supposed to work. And you walk in with your badge and you built a culture of fear, Marlowe said. That's not function. That's fear with a schedule. He came then, not slowly. A man his size who moves without hesitation relies on mass and momentum, and the physics of committed weight, and against most people, this approach has the tactical advantage of ending things before they become complicated. Marlowe sidestepped. Not dramatically, not with the kind of movement that requires the observer to revise their understanding of what is physically possible. A quiet adjustment of position, opening space where his body expected to find resistance, causing him to carry his own momentum past her and into a direction he had not chosen. She moved with him. Her first strike found the lateral surface of his wrist precise and without unnecessary force at the location where the radial nerve runs close to the skin. His hand went briefly numb. His grip, which he had been preparing to use, became temporarily unavailable. Her second strike found the lateral aspect of his knee, not damaging, destabilizing, enough to interrupt the mechanical chain of weight and balance that a large man's fighting depends on. Her third strike was to the solar plexus. She had hit harder in her life. This was not about damage. This was about ending something cleanly and in front of witnesses that needed to be ended. Harmon folded. He went to his knees first, then forward onto both hands, his body renegotiating its relationship with oxygen after a system interruption it had not anticipated. He stayed there, a large man in an unfamiliar posture, air returning in increments. The motor pool was completely silent. 20 soldiers standing in the Nevada heat, not moving, not speaking, watching something that was not simply a physical altercation, something that was revising the specific gravity of the place they occupied every day. Marlowe stepped back. Her breathing was what it had been before. She looked at the people around her, held the look long enough for it to carry meaning. Respect isn't established through intimidation, she said. She said it without emphasis, the way you say something that does not require emphasis because it is simply the truth, and the truth does not need amplification. It never was. Not anywhere that matters. She turned and walked away. Behind her, she heard Pruitt's voice, quiet, stripped of performance. Sergeant, that's enough. She did not look back. Colonel Hayes was in his office when she arrived. He looked up when she entered, and something moved through his expression, a rapid sequence of calculations that resolved into the professional blankness of a career officer managing a situation. She reached into her breast pocket. She removed the folded page. She placed it on his desk and said nothing. Hayes looked at the page. She watched his face. Reading was visible, not in his eyes, which remained controlled, but in the small muscles surrounding them, and in the altered quality of his breathing, and in the incremental descent of his shoulders, as each line of text landed with the weight of 4 years of architecture, encountering something that had not been built to accommodate it. He read to the end. He sat for a moment. How did you... I've been doing this for a long time, Colonel. She kept it simple, kept it final. He looked at the page once more. His hands flat on the desk did not move. He had the quality of a man who has reached the far edge of a structure he built himself and is discovering that the far edge has no floor. "What are you going to do with this?" he said. "That depends on what you do next." She left him with the page and walked into the afternoon. The base moved around her with the industry of a system that has its own continuous life, regardless of what is happening inside any individual within it. She thought about Aaron Delk and Timothy Rourke, 22 and 24, Georgia and Oregon. She thought about the families who had received the official version and built their grief around it, not knowing the architecture beneath was false. She thought about what it would mean to those families when the record was corrected. Not fixed. Nothing could fix it, but corrected, made to reflect what had actually happened. She had not come to Fort Caldwell to find this. But the truth had been here waiting before she arrived. It did not require her intervention to exist. It only required someone who would not walk past it. In 25 years, she had never been capable of walking past it. Cross found her at the end of the day at the back of the support building where the overhang provided a strip of shade. He had 2 cups of coffee. He offered her one. She took it. They sat in the silence of people who don't need to fill space. After a while, he said, "What's going to happen to Hayes?" "That's not up to me," she said. "He has a choice in front of him. What he does with it will tell us what kind of man he's been this whole time." Cross was quiet. The desert held its late light along the ridgeline, the long horizontal burn that comes before the dark drops in Nevada. "And Harmon," he said. "Harmon will be handled," she said, "by the system that should have handled him 2 years ago." They drank their coffee. When he left, she stayed. She sat with the last of the light and thought about the photograph on her shelf. The man who was laughing. She thought about what Cross had said in the gym about Kandahar and the 15 years between that version of Harmon and the one who lay on the parade ground staring at the sky. She understood the distance between who a person is and who they become. She had never found that understanding to be the same thing as absolution, but she had found it to be necessary. You could not look at something clearly if you refused to understand its origins. Aaron Delk and Timothy Rourke deserved to be looked at clearly. So did everything that had led to them. She turned off the light. In the dark, she thought about those 2 young men, about the families who had been handed a false account and taken it home and arranged their grief around its contours, not knowing those contours were manufactured. Tomorrow, the truth would begin its slow, institutional movement toward them, through channels, against the friction of systems that resist acknowledging what they would prefer to have buried. But moving. That was something she could name. She had arrived at Fort Caldwell looking for a quiet life. She had found instead the one thing she had never been able to walk past. She closed her eyes and did not hope for anything in particular. She had learned over many years that hope was most useful when it was specific. Right now, she was still working on the specifics. General Richard Voss was expected at Fort Caldwell at 0800. He arrived at 0743. In 31 years of command, Voss had never arrived at the time people expected him, because the expected time was the time they had used to prepare. Arriving early meant seeing the preparation incomplete, seeing the distance between what a place actually was and what it was in the process of appearing to be. Fort Caldwell in those 17 unscheduled minutes had a particular quality, deliberate order that betrayed itself through the effort required to produce it. Everything positioned too precisely. Everyone arranged with too much intention, the recognizable tension of an installation that knows it is being evaluated and has not yet finished composing its expression. Voss walked through the main gate in a staff car that nobody had flagged because it was 17 minutes early. He observed what he saw without commenting on it. He went directly to the administration building, and he did not stop at the commanding officer's suite. He stopped 2 doors down. He knocked once. Marlowe opened the door. She had been awake since 5. She had heard the staff car from her window, heard it in the way she heard everything with the portion of her attention that never fully disengages, and the particular sound of tires on the approach road at that hour had told her something was beginning ahead of schedule. Voss was 63 years old with the kind of face that decades of decisions with no good options on either side had shaped into something that revealed only what it chose to reveal. His hair was white and kept short. He looked past her into the room, the single duffel, the laptop on the desk, the photograph on the shelf. He took in the photograph the way a man takes in a detail that tells him something significant about the person whose room he is entering, and then he looked away from it with the deliberate courtesy of someone who understands that some things are not his to examine. "May I come in?" he said. She stepped back. He entered and stood near the desk and removed a physical file from under his arm. Not a tablet, not a printout. a manila folder worn at the corners, thick with accumulated history. He set it on the desk. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He opened the file and turned pages with the practiced efficiency of a man navigating to a specific location in a document he knows well. He turned past the first section through a series of tabbed dividers to the final pages. He turned the file around and placed it in front of her. She looked at the page. March 2022. A formal request for separation from active duty, submitted through proper channels, signed at the bottom in her own handwriting. She knew it before she finished reading the header. You do not forget writing something like that. The particular weight of putting those words on paper and signing your name beneath them. She looked up at Voss. "They talked me out of it," she said. "I know," he said. "I was one of 3 people who made that call." He turned to the previous page, a handwritten note she didn't immediately recognize. "I was the 3rd name." She hadn't known that. The conversation that kept her in had come through channels she trusted, through arguments she had found to her own surprise persuasive. She had not known those arguments had a specific architect, that someone she had never spoken with had decided she was worth the effort of persuading. "Why?" she said. Voss sat down in the room's only other chair. He settled into it without ceremony, a man who had occupied too many chairs and too many rooms to invest in the performance of sitting. Because people with your particular combination of capability and judgment don't exist in sufficient numbers for the institution to simply release them when they're tired. He paused. That's the practical answer. It's also true. And the other answer? He looked at her steadily. I read your complete file, not the summary, all of it. A pause. I know what you've carried. I know what the carrying cost. I thought a person who had paid that price deserved to be asked to stay rather than simply processed out. She sat with this for a moment. Outside, Fort Caldwell was reaching its morning operational tempo, the institutional sounds of a large system starting another day of its continuous function. Did they give you a reason worth staying for? Voss said. He said it without diplomatic softening. The direct question of a man who wants the actual answer and has decided that efficiency is a form of respect. She thought about it carefully. Not about the answer she was expected to give, about the true one. They gave me reasons, she said. I'm still deciding about worth. Voss nodded. He picked up the file, closed it, held it in both hands. There are things happening at this installation, he said. Yes, sir. I had reports before I arrived. I have more information than you may assume. He looked at her directly. Tell me what you found. She told him the shape of it. The incident in April 2020. Aaron Delk, Timothy Rourke. The 2 versions of the event and the 4 years of compromised silence that had maintained the distance between them. Hayes and Harmon, and the specific architecture of mutual protection. The preliminary report, the page she had placed on Hayes's desk. She told him without editorial. She laid the facts in sequence the way she had always presented operational intelligence, in the order that made the causality legible without imposing a conclusion the listener hadn't yet had the opportunity to reach themselves. When she finished, Voss was quiet for a moment. You've been here 4 days, he said. Yes, sir. He stood. He picked up his file. He looked once more at the shelf above her bed, at the photograph with the man who was laughing. And then he looked away from it with the same careful respect he had shown it when he entered. I'll need you present this morning, he said. Yes, sir. He went to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. Commander, he said without turning, the intelligence restructuring position. The offer stands. She said nothing. I'm not asking for an answer now, he said. I'm asking you to remember that it exists. He left. She sat in the room that had been hers for 4 days. The flickering light continued its long, unaddressed performance. Outside, the base was building toward full operational tempo. She thought about 2 young men and the families who had been handed a manufactured version of their son's last day. She thought about 4 years of a lie being maintained through the daily active effort of 2 men who had enough other things to do that the maintenance of it had become its own kind of normal. She looked at the photograph on the shelf. She had looked at it so many times over 2 years that she no longer saw it the way you see something encountered freshly. She saw it the way you see something that has become part of your interior architecture, present without requiring examination. But she looked at it now with the full deliberate attention she had been rationing. The laugh in it, the specific quality of that laugh, unguarded, and complete the laugh of a man entirely present in an ordinary moment. Evidence that he had been real in all the ways that people are real. That his reality did not become past tense only when her account of him did. She had given the order to fall back in 2021, knowing that the probability of full extraction was not 100%. Knowing this and making the call anyway because the alternative was a larger loss and a failed mission, and she had been trained since the beginning to make the calculation that minimized total damage. She had made the calculation. She had been correct. He had been the one who didn't make it back in time. The rightness of the calculation and the weight of the outcome had lived together in her for 3 years without resolution because they did not resolve, because the kind of resolution people tried to offer it wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known you made the right call. Those things addressed a question she wasn't asking. She had never asked whose fault it was. She had known whose call it was. That was different. That was something that belonged to her in a permanent way that no assessment could redistribute. She put the photograph in her breast, not in the duffel, not in the inner pocket with the zipper that wouldn't close. Here, on the outside, carried forward. She walked out into the morning. The briefing room at 0900, Voss at the head of the table, Marlowe to his left. Cross in the second row present in his capacity as a senior officer with direct observational knowledge of base conditions. Hayes at the far end, his posture immaculate, his face carrying the particular emptiness of a man who has spent the night with a decision he cannot unmake and has arrived at a kind of stillness on the other side of it. Harmon was brought in by 2 MPs, arm in a sling, face arranged into an expression aiming for contempt and achieving something closer to performance. He sat without being told to, looked around the room. His eyes moved across Hayes without stopping the practiced non-recognition of 2 people whose agreement not to see each other in certain contexts had been rehearsed for 4 years. Then his eyes found Marlowe. She returned his gaze without expression. Voss opened without preamble. He presented what he had been given in the flat declarative language of a man who has learned over decades of rooms like this that evidence carries more weight without the addition of his feelings about it. The incident of April 2020, Aaron Delk and Timothy Rourke, the preliminary report, the official report, the specific language differences between them and what those differences indicated about intent. He named Harmon, he named Hayes. He placed a copy of the preliminary report on the table and let it sit there while he spoke a document that had been designed to disappear and had survived in a maintenance subfolder for 4 years, waiting with the patience of things that are true. Harmon's composure lasted approximately 2 minutes. "This is fabricated," he said. His voice was steady in the way of something holding its shape through effort rather than confidence. "She manufactured this," without looking directly at Marlowe. "She came onto this base, she had a problem with me from the first day, and she went looking for something to use, and when she didn't find it, she—" "Sergeant Harmon," Voss's voice did not rise, "you will have an opportunity to speak. That time has not arrived." Harmon stopped. Voss continued. "The timeline, the dates, the sequence of documentation in the specific places where language had been altered, not to incorporate new information but to serve a different purpose." When Voss paused, Harmon tried again. His voice had shifted. Lower now, more deliberate. "You're going to take her word over mine based on something she found on a server." He looked around the table slowly. "A classified operator nobody here can verify. A file nobody's authorized to read. You know what she's actually done out there. Nobody in this room knows. Nobody can know. And you're going to let that be the basis for—" The door opened. Corporal Cade Pruitt came through it. He was in his working uniform. He had not been summoned. This was visible in the slight irregularity of his bearing, the quality of a man who has done something before fully resolving whether he has the standing to do it. He stopped just inside the door. He looked at Voss. "Sir," he said, "I requested to be included. I was told to wait outside." A pause. "I couldn't wait anymore." Voss looked at him for a long moment, then at the MP near the door, then back at Pruitt. "Sit down, Corporal," he said. Pruitt sat. Harmon's expression underwent a genuine transformation. Not performance now. What was genuine in Harmon in this moment was not a good thing to witness, because what was genuine was the specific apprehension of a man who has identified the load-bearing point of his structure and is watching someone walk directly toward it. Voss said, "Corporal Pruitt, do you have information relevant to this proceeding?" Pruitt sat very straight, hands flat on his thighs. 29 years old, looking in this moment both younger and older than that. The combination that appears in people who are doing something that is costing them while they do it. "Yes, sir." "Go ahead." Pruitt looked at the table surface for one moment. Then he lifted his head. He spoke for 11 minutes. He described the training he exercised, where he was standing, what he saw and heard. The order that was given, the conditions under which it was given, the specific state of Harmon's judgment, In those hours which had been compromised in a way that Pruitt, at 25 years old, had been too frightened to report to anyone. He described what happened to Delk and Rourke. He described the hours afterward, Harmon's instructions, Hayes's arrival, the particular construction of the account that was decided upon before the official report was filed. He described 2 years of silence. He did not perform any of it. He delivered it in the even careful voice of someone who has rehearsed something many times in private and is now saying it once in public, having decided that the saying of it matters more than the appearance of the saying. When he finished, the room was entirely still. Harmon said nothing. Hayes said nothing. Hayes had said nothing since the proceedings began. He had sat at the end of the table with his hands folded and his face at the angle of a man looking at something in the middle distance that belongs only to him. When Pruitt finished, Hayes closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he turned to Voss. "I'll have my resignation on your desk before noon," he said. His voice was quiet and clear and contained none of the diplomatic management of his earlier self. It contained instead the specific simplicity of a man who has arrived finally at the only sentence left available to him. Nobody responded. Hayes stood. He straightened his jacket with the habitual precision of a career officer. He picked up his cap. He walked to the door without looking at anyone, and the door closed behind him, and the room held the sound of it for a moment. Harmon was placed under formal arrest at 10:47. He stood when told to stand. He extended his wrists with a compliance that had a different quality than anything he had shown in the previous 4 days. Not calculation, not patience waiting for a better moment. The compliance of something that has genuinely run out. In the corridor outside the briefing room, Marlowe was standing. She had come out a few minutes before for no specific reason she could have named, which was unusual. She was a person who was generally somewhere for a reason. The MPs walked Harmon toward the door. He saw her. He slowed. The MPs allowed it. The moment had the quality of something that needed to be completed before it could be filed. He stopped in front of her. He was 6'2" with a sling on his arm and the exhausted honesty of a man for whom the performance of himself has become unavailable. He was not trying to intimidate, not trying to achieve anything. His face had the quality of a person who has reached a place in themselves they did not expect to reach while still standing upright. "I used to be good at this job," he said, almost a statement of fact, almost wondering at the distance between that fact and this hallway. A long time ago. She looked at him. She thought about Kandahar in 2009, a man carrying 2 wounded soldiers across 400 meters of exposed ground because he decided to. She thought about the 15 years between that decision and this corridor, the promotions that didn't come, the recognition that went elsewhere, the slow transformation of genuine capability into the daily exercise of power over people who couldn't push back. She thought about how a system could take what was best in a person, leave it unrewarded until the person stopped offering it, and then be surprised by what the person became in the space where that offering used to be. She understood the distance, not the choices made within it, the distance itself. "I know," she said. 2 words. Nothing added to them, nothing taken away. Harmon held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he nodded barely perceptibly in the way you acknowledge something you cannot respond to adequately. The MPs moved him forward. He went without resistance down the corridor and around the corner and out of her sight. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she walked toward the exit and into the afternoon. Cross was outside, leaning against the wall of the support building, a metal cup of coffee in his hands. He looked over when she came out. They stood together in the heat which pressed down with the full commitment of a Nevada afternoon on everything below it. "Pruitt," she said. "I know," he said. "He came on his own. I saw him in the corridor before he went in." Cross turned his cup in his hands. He looked like he'd made a decision he couldn't unmake and had stopped trying to. He had, she said, 2 years in the wrong direction, then 1 step sideways. Cross was quiet for a moment. "Voss is going to want to talk to you," and he said. "I know. You know what he's going to offer?" "Yes." He looked at her with the careful directness that was characteristic of him. "Are you going to take it?" She didn't answer immediately. She thought about the question she had been living inside for the past 3 days, which was the same question that she had been living inside for the past 2 years, which traced back to a morning in 2021 when she had come home from an operation carrying 1 fewer person than she had left with. The question was not whether she was finished. She had believed for a long time that it was that question. It wasn't. The question was what being finished actually meant, and whether the version of it she had been reaching toward, the quiet assignment, the simple logistics, the life in which she was not the person who made the call, was what she genuinely needed, or whether it was a room she was constructing to stand in while she worked out what she actually needed. Fort Caldwell had clarified something. She had not spent 4 days here and lost the instinct to look at what was in front of her. She had not spent 4 days here and discovered she was capable of walking past things that required addressing. That instinct was too structural, too deeply embedded in whatever she was at this point to be set aside by a change of assignment. It would go where she went. The question was what to point it at. And Aaron Delk and Timothy Rourke had shown her something about that question. Preventing things required seeing them before they became undeniable. Seeing them early when the damage was still preventable, that was harder than responding after the fact. It required the kind of looking she was built for applied before the crisis rather than inside it. She thought she might be able to do something with that. Across the courtyard, Cade Pruitt came out of the administration building. He stood on the steps for a moment, blinking in the brightness, with the particular disorientation of someone who has just completed something large and is now standing in the ordinary world, which has not yet caught up with the size of what they did. He saw Cross. He saw Marlowe. He did not move toward them. He was not certain she could see whether the thing he had done had purchased him a place in this conversation or whether it had simply been a thing that needed doing and was now done, and his position in relation to other people remained to be determined. She looked at him. She nodded. Not elaborate, not a performance of approval. The specific nod that carries information between people who understand its vocabulary. You did the right thing. I saw it. It counts. Pruitt held her gaze. Then he nodded back. Then he walked off across the courtyard towards somewhere ordinary and specific and entirely unrelated to any of this. You've already decided, Cross said. Not a question. She considered how to answer that. Voss mentioned intelligence restructuring, she said. Analysis, no field operations. Preventing things rather than responding to them. She paused. It's different work. Different enough. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know, she said, but I know that different is the direction I need to be moving, and I know what happens when I stand still. She straightened up from the wall. 4 days at Fort Caldwell was supposed to be standing still. He half smiled, the expression of a man who sees the logic and cannot argue against it. Take care of yourself, Cross, she said. You too, Commander. She walked across the courtyard, the same courtyard she had entered 4 days ago with one bag and no intention of becoming anyone's problem. The concrete was the same. The heat pressed down with its familiar indifference. But the courtyard felt different in the way spaces feel different when something that has been occupying them, something larger than its visible presence, has been removed and the remaining air redistributes itself into the space it left. She went back to her room. The flickering light continued its long-standing performance. The work order to fix it presumably remained exactly where it had been. She crossed to the shelf. She picked up the photograph. She held it in both hands and looked at it with the full deliberate attention she had spent 2 years rationing. The laugh in it, the completeness of it. She had known this man in all the ordinary ways that you know people you work beside for years, the unremarkable daily evidence of a person being real. The things he said that weren't significant, the jokes that landed and the ones that didn't, the way he took his coffee and the way he looked at maps, and the way he moved through a pre-mission brief with the focused attention of someone who understood that the brief was the last place where everything was still controllable. She had given the order. She had been right about the order. He had not come back. Those 3 things would live together in her indefinitely. She had stopped expecting them to resolve. They were not the kind of things that resolved. They were the kind of things that you learned to carry without letting the carrying become the whole of what you were. She put the photograph in her breast pocket. Close to the outside, carried forward. She went to find Voss. His temporary office was in the northeast wing. His aide confirmed she was expected. She went in. Voss was at the window. He turned when she entered. He took in how she was standing and where the photograph was now, and something shifted very slightly in his expression, an acknowledgement that was not quite a smile and did not need to be. Commander, he said. Sir, she said, I'll take the position. Voss nodded once, no ceremony. The nod of a man who believes something was right and now sees it confirmed and is already thinking about what it will require. Good, he said. He went to the desk, began the preliminary paperwork. She stood at the window he had been looking out when she arrived. The view was of the main courtyard moving through its ordinary operations with the self-sustaining industry of a place that has its own continuous life, regardless of what any individual within it is doing or deciding. She thought about intelligence restructuring, about analysis, about the specific work of identifying conditions before they produce damage. About Aaron Delk and Timothy Rourke, and about whether a unit focused on the right kind of looking might occasionally prevent the next version of what happened to them. Not fix the system was too large and too old to be fixed by one unit or one person, but interrupt a specific chain of events before it reached its worst conclusion. That was something, not everything, but something she could name. Voss placed the form on the desk. She crossed to it, read it, picked up the pen he offered. Heavy, military issue, the kind that has been carried long enough to be warm from the hand that carries it. She signed her name, Commander Marlowe Reeves. She set the pen down and stood still for a moment in the room that was now in a way she didn't have a clean word for a beginning rather than a stopping place. Then she walked out. The afternoon had reached the hour when the Nevada heat begins its slow negotiation toward evening, the light going long and horizontal across the parade ground, catching the dust that hung in the air above the courtyard in a way that made it briefly visible before the wind moved and it scattered. She stood outside the administration building and let the light do what light does at that hour, which is make ordinary things look briefly like they mean something. Across the courtyard, a group of soldiers was finishing a drill, moving in the particular coordinated effort of people who have practiced something enough times that the coordination no longer requires conscious maintenance. One of them glanced over and saw her and looked back at his task. Another did the same. Nobody looked away quickly. Nobody looked down. She noticed this. She did not remark on it. She filed it in the place where she filed things that were small and true and did not require addition. She walked toward the residential block. Behind her, Fort Caldwell continued its evening. Shift change beginning its rotation, the mess hall building up toward dinner service, the motor pool going quiet as the day's maintenance wound down, the drone operators trading places with each other at their consoles in the quiet, competent way of people doing work that matters and knowing it. A base carrying on, which was she supposed the best thing a base could do. She went back to the room with the flickering light. She would request the repair in the morning. Commander Marlowe Reeves accepted the intelligence restructuring position effective immediately following her assignment at Fort Caldwell. Over the 4 years that followed, her unit supported 11 field operations across 3 theaters. 0 casualties were recorded across all 11. She submitted no further requests for separation from active duty. She never filed a commendation request for what happened at Fort Caldwell. She never received one. Corporal Cade Pruitt was transferred to a training post in Virginia, where he completed the remainder of his service with a record his own people would later describe as distinguished. Colonel Warren Hayes retired under terms that were not publicly disclosed. Sergeant Cole Harmon was court-martialed in the spring of 2025. The families of Private First Class Aaron Delk and Specialist Timothy Rourke were formally notified that the official account of their sons' deaths had been reviewed, corrected, and entered into the permanent record under both their names. No ceremony accompanied this notification. Nothing could have been adequate. But the record at last said what had actually happened. That was what Delk and Rourke were owed. That was what they received.